Hey everyone, it's Scott from Heroic Studios Gaming again, and I am going to be reviewing today Hunter from the World of Darkness. Now, which Hunter, you might ask? Well, actually, both of them. So, let's get into it because I don't have a lot of time, and it's going to be a long video. So, starting off, we have Hunter the Vigil, or Hunter the Reckoning, and then Hunter the Vigil. So, here is the newest edition of Hunter the Reckoning, 5th edition by Renegade Games Studios. So this is the book that is Hunter the, it's not going to zoom in for some reason, Hunter the Reckoning, which is the newest edition of the Hunter the Reckoning line. I have it here. I've been reading the PDF for weeks, and I just recently obtained it because it just came out in June. So, I'm going to set that aside for a second. The other book we're going to cover today is Hunter the Vigil, 2nd edition, / Hunter the Vigil in general. I have had this book since March, so both of them I've only had for a couple months or a couple weeks, depending on when you're watching this. But at the time of making it, I've only had one book for a little bit of time, but I've had the PDF for a little bit longer. So, let's get into what they are. So you saw the covers. They are nice and neat, but let's talk about their history. So they're basically similar games, and I'll clarify that a little bit better. If you haven't seen my video on the World of Darkness and how the World of Darkness works, you should go find that. It is going to be in the same chain of videos as this one, which is going to be like RPG reviews, because this is my RPG Spotlight or RPG Corner videos. But so you can go find the thing where I covered all of the World of Darkness. You get a general history. But in this particular case, I will tell you a little bit more about the history of Hunter. So Hunter the Reckoning was the first Hunter game that came out. It came out in 1999 as the 6th game in the series created by the the White Wolf Publishing for the World of Darkness. It was supposed to be this series that came out along with this Year of Reckoning series, where they were essentially starting the Gehenna Wars and doing a bunch of like end of the world kind of stuff, because it was 1999 and the world was ending, according to everyone. Y2K was a thing. So they started making this game based on this idea that the supernatural world was reaching its reckoning. So the hunters were humans that had been sort of imbued with energy or power by messengers or heralds from the powers that be, that were like, hey, you human, check it out, these supernatural things are real. And it would give them the ability to sort of notice things and see things that no one else could see or do. And so that was what Hunter the Reckoning was. So that came out in 99. It went all the way up to 2004 before it got mothballed. But in the meantime, in 2002 and 2003, they made 3 video games for it, of which I have talked about or will talk about in here, depending on when I drop this video. Not sure the order, but anyway. The videos I made are covering those games, so those games do exist. They were made between 2002 and 2003. That's how I found out about the World of Darkness initially, and then I was introduced to Vampire. You should go watch my World of Darkness video if you haven't seen that, where I talk about getting involved in a Vampire LARP. But then it was mothballed, and after a while, in 2008, so it was off the shelves for about 4 years, Hunter the Vigil came out as the sort of spiritual sequel to The Reckoning, only it focused on the more like grittier, less powered play of the hunters. In fact, I think that part of the reason why that happened was because one of the lead designers was Chuck Wendig, from the comic book writer and screenplay writer, as well as Jason Achille, who I'll talk about in a moment again. But it was created as this sort of spiritual sequel to Hunter the Reckoning, as a different kind, where you are less powerful. You're just sort of normal people who know that supernatural things exist, and therefore pushed by the obligation to like do something about it. Much like the hunters that you find in the John Stakely's Vampires book. So it came out, but it was published under the New World of Darkness sort of chain, this 1st edition game. And it was following what is now called the Chronicles of Darkness path. It wasn't quite fully the Chronicles of Darkness, but it was in the Onyx path group, right? So it was part of the White Wolf series that were coming out based on this sort of secondary publishing company called Onyx Path, which we all know later became its own company and is now publishing all of the things that it wants to publish that were basically the Chronicles of Darkness, including Hunter the Vigil, which is why we have 2nd edition published by Onyx Path rather than Renegade Game Studios. So it was, around Hunter the Vigil was essentially the way that it went until it was, revamped. So basically, they're standalone games, or at least supposed to be standalone games. But there are some sections in Hunter the Vigil that are not so standalone. With Hunter the Vigil, Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition is completely standalone, but Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition claims to be standalone. But when I was trying to run some games for it, I realized that I had to turn to some of the Chronicle core book in order to do some things, because it wasn't very well explained in the Hunter book, at all. There's like a brief explanation based on the assumption that I knew what I was doing, but that's neither here nor there. The Hunter the 2nd edition development group was not the same group who developed the 1st edition, so it was a different feel. And that's just me reviewing the two different versions between Hunter the Vigil 1st edition and Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition. Hunter the Vigil 1st edition was super smooth and easy for me to understand. Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition has some complex parts that I'm not entirely sure I understand, and I've actually run the game for money. People paid me to run it, so it's not a good look. But anyway, both of them do also have their own kinds of rules for dealing with monsters, because using the full vampire creation rules for a vampire would make a vampire pretty freaking powerful, and the humans are squishy. So they have their own sort of simplified monster rules, which at least in Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition straight up states unabashedly that they have special rules for the monsters for Hunter the Vigil 2, because it needs it, right? You can't use the regular rules for it. And they just unabashedly state that. So now let's talk about Hunter the Vigil 5th edition and Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition, and what the differences are between them, because I found that, there's obviously differences between them, but I found the differences to be actually quite strange and interesting. But the interesting thing is that there's also a lot of similarities, and the similarities between them comes from their joint history, where they both were essentially the same game, or they stem from the same source material. And so it's you can feel that in both games. So the theme to Hunter the Vigil is hope versus despair, or self-preservance versus sacrifice, or the explained versus the unexplained. Sort of this theme of the unnatural versus the natural, and you as the hunter represent the natural, who knows about the supernatural, and you hold your candle flame, your vigil against the darkness to protect humanity. In Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition, it is a gothic punk game, meaning the idea that it's a game where there's beautifulness that's juxtaposed to horror, or horror that's juxtaposed to beautifulness, like a flower growing near a grave, or a kid in the playground having fun while a shadow looms over them, right? That kind of thing. And then that's the gothic. And then the punk side is that the human beings are angry at this status quo of monsters, thinking that they can rule the world, and they're going to do something about it. And so that's the sort of the feel and the theme, and it sort of permeates the entire book, and so that's kind of neat. So that's just straight up cool. But then the character creation process is similar for both games, and what's interesting is that I, when doing some research, discovered that Jason Akili, who I mentioned, was actually one of the original designers of Hunter the Vigil 1st edition, and is also one of the lead designers of Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition. That's not surprising at all if you really think about it. So there's some overlapping connection there between its original designs and then its later designs in both cases. But character creation essentially starting with a concept, and then for Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition, you will choose 3 aspirations. These are goals for your character to achieve, and they will change once you achieve one. So you achieve one, you can then add a new ambition in its place. The idea being that you're sort of, these 3, you'll always have sort of 3 ambitions, 3 things you're kind of working on when you're playing the game. And then you will choose anchors, which are something that anchors you to humanity, something that anchors you to life. And those anchors are a virtue, a vice, and a touchstone. You need at least 1 touchstone. You actually only get 1 touchstone unless you take the special ability, the merit, to where you get a 2nd touchstone, and then you can get the merit again, get a 3rd touchstone, etc. But you will have a virtue, which is essentially an aspect of your higher self, like charity or friendliness or something. And that's a thing that is like the higher self, the thing that you try to push yourself to be. And then there's the vice, which is the thing that you can't give up, the bad shadowy thing in the background that you don't talk about, whether that be lust or greed or anger or something else. That's your vice, and those two things interact with your willpower. So when you deal with willpower, you can lean on one of those two to try to restore any used willpower, and depending on which it is, depends on how much leaning you have to do. So if you just engage in a vice for a scene, you get back some willpower, but in a case of virtue, you have to like really try to like show it. And then you have your touchstones, which are people that essentially link you to your code or your conviction. And those things, you put them you'll start at 7 integrity, and you'll put your touchstone at 6. So when if you ever lose a point of integrity, which happens when you reach a moment in the game that is one of those complicated things that I will kind of try to discuss, when you reach one of these complicated moments, then you have this potentiality of losing some of your integrity, and the touchstone, as long as you have at least one touchstone attached, you get additional dice to make that save. If you don't have the touchstone attached, then you don't get the additional dice to make the save. But that's neither here nor there. In comparison to the same section of character creation for Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition, you will start with your character concept. Then you will have an ambition, which is your long-term goal, the thing that your character wants to do, like rid the city of vampires, or get even with the vampire that killed my family, or find the werewolf that tore my car apart, or something like that. You'll have this long-term goal that is supposed to give the storyteller the ability to utilize some drive for your character to push the story forward for them personally. And then you have your desire, which is a short-term goal, which is something you want to achieve like within the game session, like you want to buy a new gun, or you want to meet the voodoo priestess everyone keeps talking about, right? Those are these sort of short-term goals that aren't like something that'll drive your character forward, except that it'll be some goal you're trying to achieve in the session. And then once the session's over, you can change your desire for the next session, or if you fulfilled it, you can change it, right? So your desires change regularly. And then you're going to have 1 to 3 touchstones. And the touchstones are different in this regard because the touchstones in Hunter are just things that remind you that you're human. They're just people, and they're actually plot devices for the storyteller to utilize NPCs and to remove them at your detriment, depending on how well you're doing your job. So there's also a couple of things that you will then add to Hunter the Reckoning, which is different from Hunter the Vigil. In Hunter the Reckoning, you will then also choose your creed, which is kind of like your clan or your tribe, and if you've played some of the other World of Darkness games, and it's essentially your outlook on life. And those are going to be entrepreneurial, inquisitive, faithful, martial, underground. I think it's all of them. But I think it's all of them. You choose these things that are like your outlook on your characters. The character's outlook on life, and what those essentially do is sort of help you understand how your character will act, and particularly when you get to utilize your desperation dice, which is a set of dice that you get to use later, and I'll talk about that in the dice system. But you essentially get to utilize the desperation dice for when you're doing that action that your character is going to be good at. For example, a martial character will get their desperation dice whenever they're causing violence during the hunt. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily violence on the quarry. This could be any violence. So if they get into a bar fight in the middle of the hunt, they can use their desperation dice for that. Versus someone like Faithful, and who gets to use the desperation dice anytime they're doing anything in direct opposition to the quarry or the whatever it is that they're hunting. So if they're fighting the quarry directly, that's considered opposition to the quarry. But they could also be doing things like shutting down their like information network. That would still, or like trying to counter-hack their counter because they're counter-hack their hacker, because that would be a direct opposition to the quarry or something, right? Depending on the ruling. But that's essentially when they would get to use the dice, not necessarily when they throw a punch at somebody in a bar. Right, which is a slightly different situation. And so these different situations determine when you can use your special extra dice. And then you're going to have a drive. So each character is going to have the choice of their drive, which is the thing that pushes them forward. It's going to be a vengeance because the monsters have messed up your life, or it's going to be envy because you've seen that the monsters have power and you want it, or it's going to be I think it's redemption or something, where you're trying to be redeemed for helping them in the past. Maybe you were part of a cult or something and didn't realize it, right? And so this is your drive, and this is what pushes your character forward. And the drives determine how to get out of a situation that your character might get into, which is despair, which is when you sort of fail some of your checks with your desperation dice, and you get no successes. So you might fall into despair, where you no longer get to use your desperation dice until you redeem yourself. And that point, the redemption arc is determined by your drive. Whatever your drive is determines your redemption arc. So these things kind of interplay in your character for the long run, and how your character sort of interacts with the world, and it's very smooth. Then in both cases, the character creation will then go into the nitty-gritty number stuff, where in Hunter the Vigil, you'll have to prioritize your physical, mental, and social stats, which all start at 1. You prioritize which ones you want them to be. Like, you want your primary to be your mental, your secondary to be your physical, and your social to be your third, your tertiary. Then you would sort of choose that and then allocate dots to fill in your stats based on that. So 5 to your primary, 4 to your secondary, and 3 to your tertiary. That's how it's done. It sounds a little bit more complicated than it is. It's actually pretty snappy, pretty quick. Once you prioritize it, you're pretty well good to go. And you do the same thing for skills. You prioritize the mental skills versus the social skills versus the physical skills, and then you get 11 dots to the primary, 7 dots to the secondary, and 4 dots to the tertiary, and then you're going to choose 3 specializations. So you're doing essentially the same thing where you're prioritizing your numbers, and then you're going to apply those dots to those particular sets of stats or skills to determine what your skills and things are for your character. And then at the end, you're going to choose like 3 specializations for skills. So you'll choose like good with when it's like firearms, you might put pistols or something down, and then like subterfuge, like, whatever, deceptions or negotiations or something. On the other side, Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition does this very much more faster. It says, okay, listen, you get 1 stat at 4, 3 stats at 3, 4 stats at 2, and 1 stat at 1. Go. Right? And it just has you go allocate them, just assign them. Which one's the one at 4, which one's the one at 3. And so that's easy. If you already have your concept in mind, you're going to go, okay, well, my one at 4 is going to be the stat that I'm going to use all the time. If like you wanted to be a computer person, it's probably going to be intelligence. If you want to be a fist fighter or something, it might be strength or dexterity. Probably dexterity because that's your accuracy. If you're going to be like a lawyer, it's probably going to be charisma or manipulation, right? Like you just go choose whichever stat you want at 4, then the 3 at 3, then the 4 at 2, and then the remaining 1, whatever your dump stat is, essentially. And then for skills, same business. You choose whether you want to have a jack of all trades character, so like a character that's just a little good at everything, or like not everything, but a little good at a lot of things. Or do you want a character that's balanced, so pretty good at a few things? Or do you want a character that's a glass cannon, a specialist who's essentially really good at one thing and then kind of good at other things? And that's it. You choose whichever one of those you want. You're like, oh, I want to do the balanced one. Then it goes, cool. Then 3 of your stats are at 3, 5 of your stats are at 2, and 7 of your stats are at 1. Go. Right? It's like that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're social, if they're mental, if physical. It doesn't matter. Stack them up. Just go figure out what stats you want or skills you want and do it. That simple. On the weird side to that is there's no penalty then for any stats that you don't have any dots in. You just don't have dots in a stat. No penalty. You just don't get to roll additional dice. You will only roll whatever the stat is for the combination, and that's it. Versus Hunter the Vigil, that says if you don't have dots in the stat, then you have a negative modifier to the number of dice that you get to roll. A -1 in the case of social and physical stats, but a -3 in the case of mental stats. You just don't know that thing, and so you're bad at it. And there's a reason for why that happens versus the way that it happens in Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition, and that has a lot to do with how the dice determine success. I'll cover that in a second. Like I said, this is going to be a long video. and I'm barely covering character creation. So then, comparing them some more, you will then take 7. Both of them will then go. Let's get some special abilities and let's get some merits in here. And one calls them Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition calls them merits, and then Hunter the Reckoning 7th edition calls them advantages, right? Or 5th edition, not 7th edition. Calls them advantages. So but they're the same thing, and you get 7 points in both of them to just spend. And then in the case of Hunter the Vigil, you will then also add an additional 1 to professional rating in whatever you want your character's backstory job to be, like a mechanic or a police officer or whatever, and you get this professional rating in that, which gives you access to some contacts and things based on that. Whereas Hunter the Reckoning says, now that you've chosen your 7 advantages, your merits, you're going to do 2 points in flaws. Now you can do them as 1 point flaws, 2 1 point flaws, or 1 2 point flaw. Or you can take on more flaws and then have more advantages if your storyteller says that's fine. So your flaws are just they're there to make it so that your character is a little bit balanced. Like they've got some weakness, right? It's like an Achilles heel, right? They just have some weakness. But then you get to do something cool with Hunter the Vigil or Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition that you don't get to do with Hunter the Vigil. You get edges. And edges are very much like the endowments that go along with being in a larger conspiracy, except that they don't in Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition or Hunter the Vigil, but they do not apply specifically to a group. So you don't have to join a group to get this edge. You just have the ability you have an arsenal, or you have a library that has a bunch of books in it, or you have a supernatural ability to sense the unnatural, and so you can tell when the unnatural is near, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer's like cramps in the movie, right? Or Spidey sense, like you just know that they're near and you can deal with them. So they have these edges, and you will get to choose either 2 edges and one perk, which a perk is essentially a stack on benefit to the edge. So the edge will be like arsenal, but then the perk might be like, explosive arsenal, right? Like that kind of thing. And then, or you can have 1 edge with 2 perks, and that's really helpful. Like I made a character I made was a character that had fleet, and I was debating between whether I wanted performance, so the cars and boats that I get are like high speed, and armored, or if I just wanted armored or what. And so I had to debate if I wanted to do that option where I had 1 edge with 2 perks. So like an armored sports car sounds awesome. That's a great getaway car, right? So this is what I had to debate on. And it's like a thing, it's like an asset that does remain. It doesn't just go away. Like if somebody steals my car, it doesn't just go away. I then do it again, and then I have another one. I find them somehow. That's how this edge works. I either have access to a motor pool, or I know a guy, or I can just boost cars. That's just what I do. However it works if it works, right? Essentially. And so then you've kind of created your character. You've got your skills, stats, and merits, and then you will go ahead and choose the secondary stats. You'll have you'll figure out like what your health is and stuff. And so for Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition, it's built off of Vampire 5th edition. So it really just uses health, which is your stamina +3, and your willpower, which is your composure plus your resolve. Versus Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition, which goes like it gives you a stat for size, a stat for health, which is your stamina plus your size. Your size is going to be 5 because you're a human being. It's dumb that they even did that. Just forget the size entirely and just do your health, right? And then you'll have your speed, which is going to be your size plus your dex plus your strength. Then your willpower, which is composure and resolve. Same thing from the other one. And then you'll have this defense number, which is your dex or wits, whichever is lower, plus your athletics. And then you'll have an initiative modifier, which is your dex plus composure. And then you have that integrity thing. Now, this defense makes sense for the way that they roll the dice, and we'll get into that when we get into how to play the game. So now we've just gone ahead. We've made the basics of the character. Now we have to build our cell. And in the 2 different games, there are 2 entirely different ways to create cells, but mostly they're about creating the relationships between your character and the other characters. In the case of Hunter the Vigil, it sort of assumes that your cell is already a cell, and you can create a backstory if you want, but essentially, is your cell tier 1, meaning they're just 2 brothers in an Impala, as I like to say, or are they part of a tier 2? They're part of a compact, like a bunch of hunters in the area that make calls for each other, like the Roadhouse or something? Or are they part of a giant conspiracy that is all over the world, like the Men of Letters? So it gives you the option. Are you in these things? Because if you are, then there's different benefits. For the regular cell, for the street level cell, you get 3 tactics that you guys have preferred. You can do any of the tactics in our section of tactics, which are special actions that you take that do something cool, like whether they do extra damage to a supernatural thing or they bump you guys up so you have bonuses to your resistances or something. They're these things that you do as a group together to make yourself harder to kill. And then you will, and then that's how you do the first level. If you're the second tier where you're a compact and you know other hunters, then you get to gain 1 free dot in the status of your compact, whatever that compact is. Whether it's like the Arcanum or whatever the name of the hunters in the area are, whether it's Project Twilight, right, or whatever it is, the you get to be ready for things a little bit. And you have this 1 dot in status, so everyone recognizes who you are. And if you're part of one of those worldwide conspiracies, then you gain 2 endowments. And endowments, like I said, are much like the edges from before. They're essentially like you have access to a bunch of like armored cars, or better gear, or the ephemeral bullet that you use to shoot ghosts. Whatever the case is, and that's it. That's how your cell is created. You just you determine that. If you're playing a tier 1 game, i.e. Street Hunters, then you just have some tactics and you just go out and figure out what your backstory is. Whereas in Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition, you do a lot of stuff. You make a relationship map essentially, and you choose Chronicle Tenets, the rules that everyone in the Chronicle will follow. All of your hunters will follow these rules, and then it's the player / game character rules. And then you create this relationship map, which has the touchstones on it, the cellmates on it, the allies on it, the mentors on it, the contacts on it, the supernatural creature that woke everybody up on it, organizations that they're part of, or rival organizations that they're not part of. If they know the campaign antagonist, then that person. And you build this whole relationship map, which you then use to sort of map out where everyone is together in the cell. That's pretty cool, because then you branch out, and then they branch out, etc. And you create this nice, cool world together that gets added to the storyteller's world. Now that is added in, so we have a whole chain of like NPCs to use right there. Now, I did have a section on character advancement, but it doesn't matter that much. Both of them have different ways of handing out XP. In the case of one, you just get XP at the end of session in the traditional method, where you get some XP at the end of each session. And then you can use those to buy up your stats or your skills or your specializations or whatever. Versus the other one, which gives you these things called beats throughout the game when you do something like fulfill an aspiration or resolve a condition or risk a willpower in this sort of gambly system of risking willpower. Then you gain these beats, and then when you get 5 of them, they become an experience point, so you sort of live time track what your experience is. And then again, just like the other one, you use them to buy up your stats and stuff. So the way that these games play out is actually dramatically different. The way that it works for Hunter the Vigil, because I've been doing that one first, Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition, which came out in March of 2022, by the way, like I said. So it hasn't been out that much longer, so that's why I'm sort of going, but it is first, so I'm running it first. You're going to take and you're going to do a dice roll that is attribute plus attribute or attribute plus skill. It's exactly the same for Hunter the Reckoning, but the resolution is the dice and where they fall. So if you're doing a simple task, you're going to do attribute plus attribute or attribute plus skill. That's how you make your pool. And then you're going to use that to make a roll, and you need an 8, 9, or 10 to succeed on the roll. And those successes based on each die equal a number of successes. Now, in Hunter the Vigil, you just need 1 success to succeed in whatever the action is. If you have any more than that, cool. Doesn't really help you that much. But if you... except in the case of opposed rolls, but we're not talking about that right now. But if you get 5 or more, that's considered a superior success or an exceptional success, right? And so 5 or more is exceptional success, which gives you like whatever it is plus a benefit. And then you have the other side where if you get no successes on those dice, you get no 8s, 9s, or 10s, that's a failure, and the action fails, but it's not a crit failure. That's different. There's only one way to get that, and we'll get that in a second. So there's another way to roll the dice, which is contested, where my pool and your pool are going against each other to try to see who wins. And then in that case, when we have a contested roll, whoever gets the higher number of successes wins, and then that net number of successes equals the damage plus whatever my weapon is, right? If my using my fists, then it's just that. If it's my gun, then it's going to be like +2, right? So it's going to be like, say I had 2 over you, then I got 2 damage plus 2. So that's how that works. In the case of in a contested roll, there's still not really a way to get a critical failure or a dramatic failure. But in the case of a resisted roll, then you can. And a resisted roll is essentially a dice pool minus either some stat for resistant, like stamina, composure, or resolve. And so you have like your physical resist stat, your mental resist stat, and your social resist stat, or it's the defense number. So if they're trying to punch you, it's going to be your defense. And so that actually minuses from the pool. So if they're rolling 4 dice to punch you and you have a defense of 5, well, they actually have a -1, right? So the game says that you can't roll anything less than 0 dice, and if any time you get knocked down to 0, you still get to roll 1 die as a chance die. It's sort of a luck die. And if you get a failure on the chance die, it still fails. If you get a success on the chance die, it succeeds. But if you get a 1 on the chance die, then you have dramatic failure. So your statistical chance of getting a dramatic failure is incredibly, incredibly low. That's the system there. That's how everything's resolved. You can do something like you can use willpower to get you extra dice on your roll to keep your pool up, to like raise up your pool. And essentially, for every 3 dice you add, you'll statistically increase your chance of getting another success in the long run. You can also risk your willpower in a gambly sort of thing, where if you succeed, then you get the effect of the plus. You get to add the +3 or whatever. But if you succeed, then great. If you fail, then you actually lose that willpower point that you put on the line. So that's how that works. Now, jumping over to Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition. The way that dice work is very similar. You're going to roll your stat plus skill or your stat plus attribute. In this case, you need 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 to succeed. So you need 50% of the dice will tell you succeed or not. And then you're going to try to beat a difficulty that is set by the GM. Now, that number is going to be between 1 and 7, probably 3, probably 2 to 4 is usually what I see. And an average dice pool is going to be something like 5 to 6 dice. So that's fair. But you basically have to meet or beat the difficulty to succeed on the action. So if it's 4 and you get 4, then you succeeded, right? If it's 4 and you get 3, then you failed. So you still got successes, but you failed, and that's kind of important in a moment. An action that meets or beats is a success. The margin is a territory that is anything over the required success. So if it was 4 and you have 4, then there's a margin of 0, right? But you still succeeded, but you just have a margin of 0. The margin is important for certain things like damage. The margin for damage is the damage amount of damage is margin plus your weapon's bonus. So that's it. So if you have a margin of 0 on your shot to shoot somebody, then hopefully your dice or your gun is going to be +2 or +3, in which case you get to do 2 or 3 damage. So that's what margin is. The failure is anytime you don't meet the number of required successes for the difficulty. So that's simple enough. And then a crit failure is when you have no successes whatsoever. 0 successes. That's something to note, because if you had 0 successes, then you just failed, and there's a way to succeed. You can either spend a willpower to reroll 3 of the non-desperation dice sort of situation, or I guess you can roll desperation dice. You just can't reroll 1s on desperation dice. Or you can succeed with a penalty, right? You can succeed at a cost. So you can you say like, well, okay, the game master will be like, or the storyteller will be like, all right, you succeed, but you lose your prized shotgun or something. Or, yeah, you succeed, but you have to leave a friend behind and you have to come back for them. So that sort of thing, where you succeed at a cost. So these are the ways to deal with that crit failure, this total absolute failure. They usually apply the same thing. So when like you're just like say you needed 4 and you got 3, they'll still kind of apply the same thing. It says to kind of use that. But the thing to note is whether you have a crit failure and you used one of your desperation dice or any of your number of your desperation dice, and they roll a 1. These are things to note. So The Desperation dice are a set of dice that are based on the Desperation number, whatever that is, based on things happening in the story that the storyteller creates. It's going to be Desperation of 1 through 5. So you're going to have at least one die that you can roll in your sort of creative thing, and you can add on. It's just an additional die. It just adds on to your pool. It doesn't do anything special like in Vampire where it replaces a die. It doesn't do that. It just adds on. So it's an extra die that you just get to roll if you're doing whatever your creed says you should be doing. So that die has just as many chances of success, except that it has a chance of failure. It has 1 on it. And if you roll a 1 on that die, then you sort of create this bad situation for you. Now, if that 1 is the only number, you have a crit failure, right, this total failure where you have 0 successes, and you have a 1 on the Desperation die, then that is despair. And despair is when your character loses connection to their drive. They can't roll Desperation dice until they're redeemed, and then the redemption is whatever the process is for the drive. So they lose their drive. Versus if you did get any successes, but you still rolled a 1, and you still didn't succeed in the action, because if you beat the difficulty, you succeed, so it doesn't matter. But if you got to 3 and you needed 4, and you did have a 1 on the Desperation dice, that is a situation called overreaching. And overreaching increases the danger by 1. And the danger is the thing in the background that the storyteller uses to track when the monsters are getting closer to you, or when they're now getting suspicious, and so they start doing things differently, increase security. Or maybe they start hanging out with gangs of people equal to the number of damage, or maybe they do some encryption on their computer stuff, so now it's damage. It adds to the difficulty for trying to hack them, that kind of thing. So damage is the thing that the storyteller tracks in the background, and this is pushed up by the characters trying things and failing, and also having 1 on those Desperation dice. The cool thing is that teamwork in this game is real easy. If you help anyone with anything, you just add a die to the pool. Teamwork in Hunter the Vigil, I forgot to cover. Hunter the Vigil teamwork is that the 2 actors will both make dice rolls related to whatever it is that they're doing in that particular thing. So I'm going to roll a dice. I'm going to be the secondary, and we're driving. I'll make my driving roll, and any number of successes I get, add dice to your pool for your as the driver to see if you succeed in the action. So it just adds to your pool if I got successes, which is very much the same way that Maximum Apocalypse does it. It's instead of it being +5 to your threshold, it is extra dice because the system rolls dice. But you have to succeed to give somebody dice. Whereas in Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition, you just say, I'm helping him, and they get the dice, which is better, in my opinion. Smooths that around. Cool. So those are the 2 games in comparison. Now the conflict is where they're entirely different. Hunter the Vigil uses the traditional initiative system. You roll a d10, and then you add your initiative modifier to it, and then it determines who goes in what order. And then you have this sort of opposition where it's usually either opposed dice, or it's going to be a dice minus defense. So it's usually only opposed to dice for conflicts if the person is trying to actively dodge or block attacks that are being brought to them. Otherwise, it's just going to be the dice pool minus the defense. So if I'm going to shoot you, you're going to tell me your defense is 5, and I have 6 in my pool. I still get to roll 1 die, right? And I roll that 1 die, unless I spend some willpower to add 3 dice to my roll, right? So this kind of thing is where that comes in. And that's what we do. And then I make my roll. If I succeed, if I get any number of successes, I hit you. And then that's like the number of successes plus the weapon bonus is how much damage I do. Okay. Versus Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition, where it's just opposed dice rolling. So I roll my dice, you roll your dice. We figure out who won. That simple. But each action in combat is supposed to be, in a conflict, it's supposed to be a series of actions. So instead of it being like, I punch you, you punch me, I punch you, you punch me, it is actually like a series, like it's like a round of boxing, right? And a round of boxing is like a series of ducking and weaving and boxing and, punching and ducking and weaving some more. And then we have a break, and that's the end of the round. That's how the conflicts are supposed to work in Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition. It's not just a single action. So I don't just go, I stab him, and that's my action. It's more like we do like a back and forth where I'm trying to get in close, and then he's trying to get me away from him, and we move back and forth, and then I stab him if I succeeded in my 1 die roll to determine whether or not I won that. So that's why it's opposed, because he's going to be doing things, I'm going to be doing things, or he or she's going to be doing things, I'm going to be doing things, and then we're going to somebody is going to stab somebody, right? And so whoever wins whoever has the most wins, and if it's a tie, then nothing happens, or you both stab each other, whatever. However the storyteller wants to rule that. But that's it. And then a conflict only has 3 rounds. It's just 3 rounds, because I mean, you could go further if you wanted to, but essentially after 3 rounds, you should probably know who's winning this boxing match, right? Like, should be easy to figure that out. But like the having the different initiative like is key to it, because in Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition, it uses an initiative like if you're already in fisticuffs, then you go first because you're already in fisticuffs. If you are going to then you're already in fisticuffs, you go first because you're punching each other, and then anyone who wants to join in by shooting at anybody, they get to shoot at people after the fisticuffs have done their things. And then anyone that's taking any other types of actions or moving into fisticuffs, those guys will go after the range combat people, and that's it. Versus going through and you have Hunter the Vigil has the traditional system of like, okay, it's Bob, then the enemy, then Jim, then the enemy, then Bob, then Tommy, right? And then at the end of the round we start over. Yeah. So that's essentially it. The main thing about these games is the feel to them. In the case of Hunter the Vigil, the idea is that you are like the damage is a little bit more complex. So you have like bashing damage versus lethal damage versus aggravated damage, whereas in Hunter the Reckoning, 5th edition just has superficial damage, which is damage that's not too rough and goes away after about 15 minutes, or well, not about 15 minutes. It goes away after a scene if the storyteller's being generous, or the game session if the storyteller's not being generous. And aggravated damage, which is just intense damage. So there's like these different layers. So the games sort of have different feels, whereas Hunter the Vigil feels more nitty gritty. And it has, it's got like you're working with tactics and stuff, and you're trying to use your team together, and you're maybe joining some conspiracies and your compacts, and you're doing all of these different things. It's a little bit more dense and compact, and then it has the things that I was saying that I didn't really understand. So it's got this thing like social maneuvering, where you're trying to crack a nut, right? You're trying to interrogate someone in a police station. There's this sort of way of doing it that isn't natural in my mind. You have to, they have the storyteller has to essentially determine a series of doors, which are the blocks that the person has in place to keep them from just falling to the whims of whoever asks them a question. And you have to do this thing where you break down the doors. Now you smoothly maneuver through the doors until you get them open and the person tells you things, or you can bust them down and then they hate you for it afterwards. But this complex social system of social maneuvering. And then you have the same thing for finding clues. You have something very similar for finding clues. Like the storyteller determines that in order to give you information about a crime scene, for example, the storyteller has determined that there are 5 clue elements, and then your team will make a bunch of dice rolls to see if you find those clue elements. If you find all of the clue elements, then the storyteller tells you what you found. If you didn't find all of the clue elements, then you don't get to find out anything. Really, it's kind of confusing as to whether or not you find out anything at all. So instead of it being like individual clues that make sense, and then you piece together, you as the players piece together with the information that I handed you, what happened, this is like, if they don't find all of them, then they don't know. Or if they find all of them, then just hand them what happened. It's like, it's weird. But then it's like, what did they do with these clue elements? And the book indicates that they can use these clue elements to get bonus dice in later rolls. And I'm just like, in the scene, like, are they supposed to help with the investigation, or do you mean like later on? Is it an asset that they hold on to? And it sort of implies that it's an asset that's on the character's like gear list, essentially. So that's one of the things that I don't quite understand, and even in Chronicles it doesn't explain that super well. So that's something that I need to really figure out, despite the fact that I've actually run this game for money. I think it did okay. I don't think anyone noticed that I didn't really know what the hell was going on when they were doing an investigation, but that's fine. So, in social combat in Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition is very simple. It's the exact same system as physical combat. Only instead of doing damage to somebody's physical body, they do damage to their willpower. And if they lose all their willpower, they lose face. That's real easy. Like, that is real easy. Yeah, that's it. So those are the 2 games. I guess what I should talk about now is their design. So Now that you've sat through 42 minutes of me talking about how they are the same and different, let's just do a quick little synopsis of my feelings about the design of the book, because I always talk about the design of the book, and you've waited 44 minutes now, so congratulations. Second longest video so far. This is Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition, and Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition still feels like it was made based on the 90s style of like compact pages of information. So lots of information on a page, some blurred out edges with images in the background. So you've got text on textured pages essentially. They did clear it out in the center, so it's not fully textured, but you get where I'm going. But it's just like dense information with paragraphs that are written like paragraphs, and so it's just a lot. So it's very hard to read it if you're not super great at reading, right? For me, it was fine. Like, I don't have a problem with it, but for other people who aren't super great at reading, this might be a bit rough. But it's sort of this sort of gray or green tones. There's not really color pictures. It's just all sort of this black and whitish style, and like, you know, art that's kind of weird. But it's fine. I wasn't initially unimpressed with its design, but I was actually kind of unimpressed with its design. I thought like, hey, I thought we lived in the 2000s here. I thought we lived in the 2020s here, because this book was originally kickstarted in 2020, in like March of 2020. I thought we lived in the 2020s. I thought we knew how to make books that looked nice and smooth. And, you know, this is kind of cool, but this is like, it's like the same style from before. In fact, if I were to take the old World of Darkness, or old Hunter the Vigil book in 1st edition and put them right next to each other, it would look like this. They would look the same. So, I mean, also, like I said, there were some things that I had to look up to fully understand that weren't entirely explained perfectly in the book. So I'm a little off by that. So that's a little going to throw off my views of it a little bit. But it did have a lot of good information, and like it does have this whole section on like making monsters, and it had a bunch of different monsters. It had 24 pre-made antagonists, 16 of which were supernatural things, but they were supernatural things that exist in certain areas. So it was kind of like, well, I guess I could use it, but this is a Yeti. So it would be weird to use it in the deserts of Arizona, but you know, whatever. But they were things that like I would know. Like I would know what this was. This is a Sasquatch that they're talking about, or this is a typical red cap killer thing, or whatever. But it had 16 strange things, 3 sentient locations, which was super cool. Sentient locations like hotels of murder, right? And then 5 slashers, so 5 serial killers that have become Jason Voorhees or Freddy Krueger. Right? There's like some level of dread power that they've taken on, and they can do things outside the normal of just a serial killer. So that was cool. So I will say that and there was like 14 compacts or agencies that the characters can be part of, which includes also the special abilities and things they get access to if they do join them, like spells if they're in certain groups, or guns if they're in other groups, or that kind of thing. So that was cool. So I will say that's cool. So I will give it, I'm going to give it a thumb in the quarter, like a thumb and a quarter. Because it was fine. It gave me all the information I needed. I was excited to play Hunter again. So I was like, this has got great stuff, but not all of its information is super well organized, and the book is kind of dense. And it seemed like it wanted to focus more on the compacts and conspiracies than a lot of the other things that I wanted to know more about. In fact, there's like a whole giant section of that. But in its defense, I didn't have to read through 30 pages of exposition about the World of Darkness before I could just start learning how to make my character. So that is an upside for them. Now, Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition literally just came to me recently. It was released on June 22nd of 2022, and this video is being made in the early parts of June of 2022. So, it's only been out for a bit of time. But, my friends, this is what you do when you jump a game up from the 90s to the 2020s. Super slick cover, nice and matte, very cool. But cool colors. Like, they had to use orange because orange was the original color of Hunter the Reckoning. But I do have one of those dumb stories that I talk about, which is fine. Every RPG book tends to do this sort of thing. It's fine, but it's short. It's only 2 pages. Whew. World of Darkness, you learned a thing. I appreciate that. But anyway, look at how slick this is. Look at it. It's neat. The artwork is kind of black and white, but has this orange highlight. They're all like that. They all have orange highlight in them. And they all, some of them, a lot of them look like photos that they then just overlaid the orange stuff onto. But it's very cool. And it starts off describing, what is Hunter. And then, it's like a reckoning has come. It's time for the hunters to stand up to the status quo and say, screw them dark forces. Just randomly flipping, you can see that the book is not quite as dense as the other one. It is still sort of paragraph style, but it is not nearly as dense. And the pages are white with the orange highlights. Even the pages that are full images, right, are like this and going that way. So it's still nice and clean. Things are organized neatly. And then you've got, this, like I said, this cool art. Organization-wise, there's a few things that I do have some problems with. And so I am not going to say that it's perfectly organized. It's got some flaws. It also has some rules that, seem to be a bit weird. Like, for Hunter, you'd expect to want people who are a little bit more inclined to do combat because inevitably you have to do combat with the monsters. But the combat rules are severely lacking in here. There's advanced combat rules from Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition that would absolutely apply in the situations that you want your character to get into, like cover and stuff. Those are in there, but I mean, like maneuvering is one of them that stands out to me. Maneuvering positions. I absolutely think that every player who plays Hunter is going to want to try to maneuver to a better position, which gives them advantageous benefits to their actions when dealing with their enemies. Why would they not do that? Maneuvering is not a thing that's even explained at all, but it is in the advanced rules for Vampire 5th edition. However, to clarify, so those things that I thought I would be saying negative, it was brought up on a World of Darkness newscast from one of the main developers for the game. And what they brought up was that the game itself is going to be part of a bigger series of books that are coming out, supplements, and one of the supplements is a supplement that is supposed to be for all of the new World of Darkness games that are coming out, including things that are, like for storytellers specifically, that are about things like advanced combat and stuff, so that they don't have to keep including advanced combat rules in each of their books. They can just have this one reference point for advanced combat to tack on to all of them, so that when they have Werewolf, the Apocalypse 5th edition, and Mage, the Ascension 5th edition, that they don't have to do this crazy business where they have to include all of these combat rules and whatever every time. The other thing that I have is that the way that they organized the organizations, they do a lot of talking about organizations, and then very little talking about gear and tactics, right? It seems very strange to be like, there's all of this information, but they wanted to be sort of inclusive and have various groups from various places. Some of the groups are specifically South American or antagonists, rival organizations, which are also primarily antagonists. That's the other side to it. These rival organizations, there's 11 of them. They are presented as primarily protagonists because they have bureaucratic nonsense that gets in the way of actually doing the good. Some of them really want to do the good, but they've got to deal with taxes and secure borders and things like that, and so they can't really do them. And so if you're in them, you're a hunter who doesn't have the drive. You're just a person who hunts, and in some cases for money. And so these hunter organizations are not necessarily things that your characters can be involved in, but they do exist so that a storyteller can use them in that way if they want. So that's a benefit. But they are primarily antagonistic in style. But then they also have them, they have them all listed, and then they're like, and here's sample antagonists that are based on these guys. And I really wish that they had just included that in with the organizations, and I can just be like, oh, they were dealing with this organization, these are antagonists. Like the SWAT, this is the stats for a SWAT team member, right? That's in this organization. But anyway, so that's like one of the flaws. The other flaw that I have is that, that I think is a flaw, but other people seem to like a lot, was that in the case of the monsters, they do go into some sample monsters. First off, the thing they did really well is tell me how to make them if I wanted to make them, which is great because I made a bunch for the campaign that I'm about to run. But then they're like,
here's some sample vampires essentially, and there's like here's the vampire, and it goes on for like pages about the vampires, like general motivations and their movements and how to find them and their tactics and what they'll do, and that's fine. But like that's I mean it's fine. I kind of feel like it could have been a block rather than several pages, right? You give me a block of like their motivations, their general tactics, and how they want to do things, and then some of their story. But it like goes into like he was born and raised on the streets of Los Angeles in 1940, and it's like, man, I don't care honestly. But I guess I do if you're gonna try to insert it into your chronicle and make it like a long story of investigating this person and who they are and what they're doing. So, but otherwise, I give Hunter the Reckoning like 1.75 thumbs, like quite the opposite to the other one. Like I said, there's some flaws. I like the combat thing is essentially the flaw. There's some stuff that I think would be a little bit cooler. I think that there's also not very many edges, and if they had some more edges, that would have been nice. That would have been cool. But I guess we're gonna hopefully get some more in future supplements, or your storyteller is gonna help you create them based on your character. But the edges are designed to be not perfectly well defined, so that you can manipulate them for your game. So like the edge, like I was saying, a fleet, right? It doesn't specify it as cars specifically. It says like conveyances, right? And it also doesn't specifically specify what armored looks like. And so I can change those things up based on the way that I want to do it. And the same thing with like a good one for this is artifact. Artifact is a thing that gives you a benefit, and that thing is either imbued supernaturally or with science tech. And so instead of it being like an amulet that gives me +1 to my dice rolls because it's an amulet of power, which it could be, it could instead be like a device that I have, an EKG reader or something that I use to determine what electromagnetic fields are going on around me, so I can find ghosts, right? So that's like that. Like it could be anything, and that's really well done. So the 7 or 8 that we have of these edges, we can do stuff with them without having to be like, well, it didn't say that in the edge. So that's it. So that's my review. That's my review of not just Hunter the Reckoning, but also Hunter the Vigil, a side-by-side comparison of the two. 1.25 thumbs for Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition, and 1.75 thumbs, or 2, it's pretty much 2, like it's basically 2, for Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition. So that's it, everybody. That's a long video, the longest video I have now made, the longest. So I hope that you enjoy it. I hope that you like the information that I provide, and I'm going to actually have to make a graphic of this because it's so long. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again later.